Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast, 9 Things That Set Progressive People Companies Apart from the Rest. This program is presented exclusively for members of HR People and Strategy, SHRM's executive network. HRPS would like to acknowledge our sponsor for this program, Sage People. We want to provide you with a quick overview on using this webinar interface, starting with this tip, and that is that refreshing is a good way of solving any problems you have. We are streaming on the internet today, and streaming media like this can get disrupted. If you experience a problem with sound breaking up or slides not advancing, try hitting F5 if you're on a PC or Command R if you're on a Mac. Often that refresh takes care of the problem. On the player toward the bottom, you should see a row of program icons. Those buttons control each of the windows on the webcast player. When you click one, it will open or close the corresponding window, and if you click it again, it will do the opposite action. Keep that in mind if you shut a window during the program and you want to get it back. You can move the window displaying the slides by clicking and dragging it, and you can change the size of the slide display by dragging that window from the bottom right, or there's a large square sizer in the upper right of the window. If you click that, it will bring it to full screen. We have PDF versions of the presentation slides available in the Program Resources window just below the HRPS logo on the left side of the screen. There are 2 versions of the same content. One has 1 slide per page. The other has 2 slides per page to save on paper and ink if you're printing out. We'll have time at the end of the presentation for a question and answer session with our speaker. If you're viewing the live webcast, we encourage you to submit questions at any time during the program. Under the resources box, there's a widget you can use to submit your questions. We are going to hold questions until our speaker's presentation is complete, and we'll get to as many as time allows. And now about today's program. Progressive people companies are realizing that if they want to attract the best, they must change how they think about HR and their people. As a result, they're moving towards automating a lot of the traditional ways of working to focus on their people and designing great workforce experiences for them. Today you are going to hear how people companies are embracing new skills and roles in HR teams, such as people scientists, business psychologists, designers, and marketing and communication specialists, often led by a chief people officer. We are pleased to welcome Paul Buren to lead our program today. Mr. Buren is a work trends expert, self-proclaimed people geek, and vice president at Sage People, a global cloud HR and people platform that helps organizations around the world acquire, retain, manage, and engage their workforce. With introductions complete, I'm pleased now to turn over the webcast microphone to our speaker, Mr. Paul Buren.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here, and welcome everybody. The agenda today is really an interesting one in that, first of all, we're going to look at a number of challenges which exist in the workplace, some of which are known, but surprisingly a number of which are perhaps less well known. We'll then go on to look at how we can address some of those challenges and this whole concept of people companies and what that means, and what are some of the key characteristics of so-called people companies. We'll be looking at the 9 things that set these companies apart from other types of business or organization. And then we'll conclude by following up with some next steps that you can take if this topic is something that you're very interested in and would like to have the opportunity of either building on some of the things that you might already be doing or potentially applying some of these principles as you develop ongoing strategies for your businesses. So let's move through, and we will talk a little bit about these challenges in a little bit more detail. So first of all, there is an engagement and a related productivity crisis which is affecting many different businesses around the world. So this is not just an issue in the United States, it's an issue in many different countries. And it's really quite fascinating. First is around the whole problem of engagement. Now, many businesses have been managing or trying to manage engagement and measuring engagement for a long time. The somewhat staggering thing is that the research shows over a number of years that really just 1 in 3 people at work are actually fully engaged. That means they're fully motivated, they're really committed to what they're doing, they're absorbed by what they're doing, and therefore they're really participating and contributing to the success of the business. So if you think about that 1 in 3, that means that 2/3 of most organizations' workforce, and that may not just be full-time employees, it may also be freelancers or contingent workers or even people that are participating from the gig economy. But whatever, only 1/3 engaged, 2/3 of those people are not. So if you think of a meeting and you think of the number of people you have in a meeting, immediately you've got a problem. 2/3 of the people that are even attending that meeting are not really that focused on what's going on in the way that they might be. So that's a real problem. And you think, well, with all the surveys that have been done on engagement and all the different approaches that have been taken, this really would have been resolved by now. But the data suggests that this is not the case. A second related issue, and one which is really quite astonishing, is that when you look at productivity growth and you look at this over a long period of time, in spite of the fact that we've been using technology and other techniques to try to improve performance and improve productivity in the workplace, we can actually see from the chart on the right here that productivity growth over time has really not actually moved very much. I mean, yes, it has fluctuated up and down each year, but this chart goes back to 1950. And if you put a trend line through that data, first of all, I would suggest that the trend line is pretty flat, if not slightly negative. And secondly, if you look at the last few years from, say, 2010, you can see that there has been a significant decline in productivity over that time period. So this really is quite fascinating, because in spite of the fact we've got all this technology and all sorts of more modern ways of working, if we actually look at the overall performance, it's not actually getting better, it's not improving. And not only is it not improving, it's actually costing the economy a huge amount. Estimations are between $450 to $550 billion per year in lost productivity. So what on earth is the problem? I mean, there's clearly a sort of series of issues here that we need to understand more about, and we'll explore a little bit more about this later, but that's the first key challenge. Now let's look at another key challenge. Another related challenge is that, as we all know, particularly if we're working in tech sectors or professional services or economies where there's a real need to actually apply contemporary technology, we know that it's harder than ever to attract and to keep really good people. Sage did a survey last year where we spoke to about 500 different HR and people leaders in the United States and elsewhere. And we really found that they're facing a number of common challenges. We talked a little bit about the problem of getting the best out of their people, but they're also really concerned about recruiting and retaining top talent, particularly as we've got an ongoing global skills crisis, which doesn't appear to be getting any better. And on top of that, there's two other related issues that they speak to. One is actually how do they go about increasing HR productivity and adding business value, and really trying to deal with these issues around finding and keeping top talent, and also being able to look after people. And how do they actually are in a position where they really know their people? So surprisingly, a lot of organizations are struggling with that. Now, if we move on to the third key challenge, then the third one is that employees, when you actually go and talk to employees and you survey employees, they're actually not satisfied with the sort of experiences that they typically receive when they're in the workplace or at work. And it was interesting. This was a survey that, again, Sage did last year, where we surveyed a large number of employees in Canada, United States, and the UK. And we asked them some very specific questions about this. And the first thing that was quite interesting is that about a third of them admitted that they're only productive for probably less than 30 hours a week. So, I mean, that's quite a worry in itself, because that suggests that there's obviously scope here, admitted by the employees themselves, that they could actually be more efficient or more effective at work. Secondly, about 66% of them indicated that being valued, being recognized, being appreciated is one of the most important aspects of their work. So if you think about that, those sorts of attributes are not surely that difficult. It's not as though a company has to invest huge amounts of money in order to have leaders, managers, and others in the business, peers, colleagues, actually valuing, recognizing, and appreciating other people around them. Third key point, 78% said that positive workforce experiences have a huge impact on their productivity. So that is, employees are actually recognizing and stating that they need this, they crave it. And this is something that is common to all human beings, something that is fundamental to the way we operate. If we get recognition, if we are appreciated, if there are positive experiences that we're part of, you tend to feel a lot better, you tend to have more energy, you're more engaged, you're more motivated, your performance tends to rise. And this increased to 92% when we actually focused on the younger generations at work, particularly millennials. And they indicated that these positive experiences really impacted their productivity. But what is astonishing in a way is that only 12% of those that we surveyed are actually asked regularly as to what would improve their experiences at work. So there is a real challenge here in that many companies don't fully understand the importance of workforce experiences and don't fully understand the importance of this about actually tying to performance and productivity. Now, what's quite interesting about this is that if you have these sorts of conversations with senior managers, quite often they will say, oh, well, that's all very nice, but that's a sort of an HR issue. It's not actually going to make a big impact on the business. And this is actually something which is a common misunderstanding in many businesses, because this isn't just about HR and people, it's also about financials and economics. And more recent research by Jacob Morgan and others have indicated that we don't really seem to understand that in order to improve engagement and therefore drive performance, there's something that you have to do. You have to actually deliver great experiences, because engagement is a reaction. It's an output. It's something which happens after the fact. If you're not engaged, if you're not enjoying this conversation or this webinar, then it's because the experience you're having is not a good one. And because the experience isn't a good one and there's other issues going on around you, then you're likely to be less engaged and therefore you're not paying full attention, which means you're not going to get as much out of it. And the same happens at work. So there's this causal understanding that great experiences drive or increase engagement, and that in turn will drive performance. So experience is the cause, it's the root cause, as opposed to engagement, which is the effect. The other key point around this is to appreciate that companies that really understand this and are focusing on their employees actually see an increase in revenue by a factor of 2, an increase of revenue per employee by a factor of 3, and an increase in profit per employee by a factor of 4 over companies that don't invest in their employees in this way. So it's really simple, but it's really critical to appreciate that great workforce experiences actually drives performance. So that's the third key challenge. 2 more, and then we'll get into the next part of the presentation where we'll look at as to how we can address some of these. But the fourth key challenge is quite interesting in that although many companies have invested heavily in CRM systems and are in a position now where they know quite a lot about the customers that they sell to, and they have a lot of data and a lot of information, and they really try to focus hard on the customer experience and selling to customers and making sure that customers have great experiences and therefore want to keep doing business with the organization. But when you ask employers, well, how well do you know the people that work for you? It's really quite surprising, even after all these years when we've had so much conversation around this within the industry. So again, some surveys and research that we did last year demonstrated that if you ask most HR professionals about the importance of this, then, I don't know why this is jumping a little bit, but we'll go back to the right slide. So if you ask most HR professionals as to, is this such an important thing? Should you make people decisions based on data and analytics, or do you just rely on sort of gut feelings and ad hoc information? As you can see here, 83% indicated that no, absolutely, you should be. I'm a little surprised it's only 83%. I would have thought it might even be higher. But anyway, most people think that's a sensible thing to be doing. And yet, when you look at the reality as to what happens in practice, the survey suggested that only about 37% of people's decisions are actually based on data and analytics. And even when people are using that information, 92% of them actually still struggle to gain strategic insights from their people data. So, we've still got a fundamental problem in that not only do we have some of these other issues that we're trying to deal with, but we also have this fundamental problem that employers very often don't know their people or don't know as much about their people as they probably should do, and struggle, therefore, to actually make the right sort of level of investments when it comes to developing talent. Final key challenge is really all around the technology and processes that are happening in the whole HR function. And there's two aspects to this. First is that HR processes are changing, and we're seeing sort of signs of this every day from new processes around recruitment, perhaps, for example, involving social media and social conversations as part of the recruiting process, or perhaps changes in the way we manage performance, or the way perhaps companies think about learning and so on. So all these processes are changing. But what is also changing is technology is changing around these processes. And what's fascinating is that many of us are using all sorts of different types of technologies. Many of us are on our mobile devices with all these different apps that are available. And we have these really great experiences. And we're expecting those within the workplace itself, and we're expecting those within the technology that we're using. But many companies still don't have this. That many HR applications are really still quite dated, and in many cases, companies are still relying on spreadsheets to actually manage people in the workplace. So if we sort of summarize all of this very quickly before moving on, we know that there's a growing global skills crisis, and the war for talent is still a challenge. We've seen that productivity and engagement remains a major issue for many companies. Employers still don't know enough about their people, yet workplace technology and HR processes are changing, and as a consequence of this, with the nature of work changing, the workforce changing, many traditional HR processes are no longer fit for purpose. They're changing, and the systems that are being used are struggling to keep up with some of these changes. So we've got a lot going on, and there's a lot of challenges around how we actually get this to move in the right way. But let's have a look at some of the ways forward that more progressive companies are now adapting in order to try to solve some of these sorts of problems. And really, the way we look at this is we see that there's a fundamental shift happening in HR. Just as we saw a shift going back, I think, into 1980, from personnel to HR, and we've seen changes in HR over the last several decades, but we're seeing a pretty disruptive change now as we move away from a focus on transactional HR, where we're focusing on how HR processes get done and trying to automate those, to a focus more on people, where the people in the business are now the center of the focus as opposed to just trying to automate transactional processes. And companies that are doing this, we refer to as people companies. So a people company is, as you can see, an organization where people are truly the most valuable asset in the business. And because of this, the companies are only going to really succeed and be successful in situations where the workforce is successful. So in order to make sure that the business is going to succeed, it's not enough just to think about customers and shareholders. You have to think about your workforce first before everything else. Because if your workforce is not efficient and effective and productive and really on their game, then it's going to impact customers. It's bound to. And that in turn will impact shareholders. So really smart companies where people are critical to the success of the business understand this. And because of it, these sorts of companies are having to start thinking very differently as to how they manage their people. They need to know and let their people know how valued they are. It's reflected in the culture and the values of the business. It's reflected in how employees feel about the company. This in turn is reflected in the output of how people work, their performance, and it's all really about having more of a people-first approach. So, what sets people companies apart? What are the sorts of things that happen in people companies that actually deliver these sorts of outputs, this improvement? And in many companies, this is the beginning of a journey. We're not suggesting here that every company has necessarily sort of done all of this and they've reached the end game. This is likely to be a journey that's going to happen over several years as companies become people-oriented, become people companies. So let's have a look at some of these different criteria, different things that happen in these sorts of businesses. And there are 9 of these different criteria that we're going to talk about now. The first one is these sorts of organizations create meaningful and tailored workforce experiences. Now, what does that really mean? Well, if you think about customers and customer experience, then what happens in that situation is as companies sell to customers, they're thinking the whole time about the customer experience. So whereas it's not just about selling, it's about the whole process. From the moment the customer starts looking about different products, maybe online, exploring on the web, right the way through to how they actually purchase, and then the quality of the product, and then the after-sales service, and all that sort of stuff, all of that forms part of the customer experience. Well, the same sort of argument can be applied to the workplace and to employees. You think about the employee life cycle or the employee journey from hire to retire is what it used to be called some while back. And if you think about that whole journey, through that journey you have a whole series of experiences. From the moment when you think about wanting to join a company, through the whole recruitment process, the hiring and the selecting and the onboarding process, then being part of the business and what happens on a day-to-day basis and the day-to-day experiences that you have with your manager, with your colleagues and peers or people across the business or outside of the business even. And then obviously you've got performance reviews and how you learn and develop in the workplace. Everything that you do all has an impact on you, and you experience different things. And collectively, if they're great experiences, then you're actually going to be in a position where you're likely to be more engaged and therefore performing more highly, as we spoke about earlier. Now, to do this, many companies are now starting to think about each sort of key part of that life cycle, and they're starting to think about, well, what are those experiences? How do people think, and what do they feel about these different processes and how we work and how things get done around here? And the most successful companies are using pulse surveys and getting constant feedback from employees, which they act on very fast in order to be able to create these really great experiences. And it can sometimes be really simple things that actually make a difference. So, for example, a personal situation that I came across actually just earlier today. So I've got somebody on my team that is joining the business. They are going to have to travel. They're going to come across from the US to Europe in order to attend some courses in Europe and meet different people over there. And as part and parcel of that, they were obviously just starting and they were trying to understand what they needed to do and where they needed to go. And we have somebody that focuses on the whole onboarding experience. And the reason that we feel this experience is so good, and we're told that by the feedback we get, is because this individual reaches out the whole time, not just sends them an email or the equivalent saying, welcome to the company, blah, 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 see you next week, but actually went out of her way to explain, when that person arrived, what were the different types of transportation that they could take in order to get to their hotel and where the hotel was, how they could get from the hotel to where the meetings were being held. But more critically, they also gave the individual their personal contact details and said, look, if you've got any problems, anything you need to know, give me a call. Be only too happy. And when you get over here, if there's any challenges, either call me or I live fairly locally. I'll be prepared to come and help you. It's those little things that make such a massive difference. And that's just a small example of creating great candidate experiences in the context of the workforce or the broader workforce experience. So, second key thing that people companies do is they make people decisions based on people science. Now, interestingly, many companies still struggle to do some basic things well. And we often have customers, before they become customers, which struggle to do simple things such as getting a headcount report. I mean, we have, for example, one customer who I won't name. Before they became a customer, they're a market-leading business services company, and yet they have a number of people. So they have about, I think it's over 1,000 people working for them, but they're spread across a number of different countries. And for them to get a headcount report actually used to take them 2 months before they were able to do that, because they didn't have a single system of record. They didn't have all the information they needed in one place. It wasn't immediately available to them. And so as a consequence of all of that, they really struggled in order to be able to get information. Now, that may not apply to every company, but it's surprising how many companies don't have all the necessary data that they need to make people decisions. They don't have real-time information at their fingertips, and they can't do some of the basics. So the first thing is obviously to be able to address that. Can you actually have it? Do you have a single system of record, or do you have the ability to get real-time information about your people really quickly? And then just as other businesses are employing data analysts and data scientists to really explore things like customer data or operational data, people companies use people scientists and people science to do the same sort of thing. They're not only looking at reports and dashboards and information about their employees, but people scientists will also look at data and look for underlying patterns or trends in data which may not be immediately apparent from a report. And by doing that, they can also help companies make better information about things like succession planning, or top performers, or people in the business that may need certain types of support. They can find all sorts of things out that you wouldn't necessarily know without deploying these types of approaches. So that's a second characteristic of these sort of people companies, making decisions based on data and using people science. Now, a third characteristic is understanding the nature of the modern workplace and embracing modern ways of working. We all know that the markets are changing constantly, technology is changing constantly, businesses are having to move even faster than they have previously. The pace of change just seems to continually accelerate. And I think we're all feeling that and managing that, or trying to manage that in the context of our day-to-day work. Now, for many businesses, this means that they need to remain flexible. They need to be as agile as possible to be able to respond to changing situations. And that means that they need to be very flexible in terms of how things get done. And as a consequence of that, they really need to be able to offer flexibility to their employees, to the workforce. They need to be able to provide the capabilities to support truly mobile working, to provide on-demand working. And so to enable all of that to happen, they need to ensure that processes are lean, processes are flexible, particularly HR processes in this context. They also may need to be able to support different types of organizational design. So we know that companies are typically managed in sort of hierarchical or matrix fashions, but the reality is the way we work is usually based on teams. And we may work on multiple different teams, and when we're working on different teams, we perhaps play different roles, and we use different skills. And very often, our processes and systems don't really capture that in an effective way. And so one of the key things around all of this is the need for modern systems and modern processes to reflect different types of organizational design, reflect the real ways that people are working in companies, and also to be able to help manage things like work-life balance as part of this. Now, I think many of us are working in a more on-demand way because of the nature of mobile devices and being always on. But that also means that we have to have the ability to self-manage and self-regulate so that we can determine work-life balance. And that might mean that during the course of a day, personal things interact from a time point of view, a timeline perspective, with work. So you might be working on different projects and different things for a period of time, and then there may be some personal things you have to do. It could be take the kids to school, or maybe pick something up from the store, or maybe make a couple of personal calls, or maybe go see somebody. perhaps somebody that needs some of your help, but it may not be a business-related interaction or call. But then you're weaving work back into it. So this sort of complete flexibility in terms of the work styles is something that modern people companies embrace, because they realize that that's the best way of enabling people to manage their lives more effectively, contribute fully, and be very productive. Then another key point is the power of the employer brand. They understand this and they use this. People companies really understand the importance of the employer brand. Now, companies all have brands. Some are good, some are not so good. And marketing has spent years, very often, or in the case of younger companies, and maybe not so long, but they still worry about how do you get brand awareness and how do you get people to not only become aware of the brand, but you want them to relate to the brand in a very positive way. And that is a really difficult thing to accomplish. Now, because of the war for talent and the global skills crisis, companies are recognizing that they have to get marketing to help them to really do people marketing, market the business to the marketplace, to prospective employees. You have to get the employer brand out there, and you have to be able to explain to potential employees, what is the culture of the company? What are your values? What does the company do? Why are you such a great place to work? And as you do that, you actually start to promote the employer brand. And people companies really get this. They're using marketing support. Sometimes they'll bring marketing into HR. Sometimes that they will work more closely with marketing functions so that HR and marketing become much more closely aligned in order to make sure that there is an alignment between the value that the brand is communicating to consumers or to customers and to the employees. So there's brand consistency, and that's being perceived and recognized both internally within the business and externally outside of the business. So the importance of the employer brand, the importance of marketing, the importance of contemporary communications is really critical in people companies. So let's look at a few other key attributes. We've covered a number so far, but there's a few more as well that we can pick up on. We talked about HR processes changing. Well, another key part of this change within people companies is the way that performance is actually managed. Now, many of us are very familiar with annual or maybe biannual performance reviews, where typically a series of goals are set at the beginning of the year, and then things happen during the course of the year, and then there's a review at the end of the year. And usually it's a challenging experience both for the manager and for the employee, because often there's not the full information available, or often the goals that may have been set at the beginning of the year may not have been relevant by the time they got to the end of the year or whatever. Many organizations have recognized that the way we work has changed, and because of the pace of change and because of the need for businesses to be much more agile and much more responsive, so processes have to change, and performance management is a good example of one of these processes which is changing. And the change really is around the recognition that because things are happening so fast, goals often change multiple times during the course of the year, or may need to be constantly adapted or refined during the course of the year. And so the shift has happened away from just an annual or maybe a review every 6 months to this idea of continuous conversations, and also to have the ability for peers to recognize people in the workplace as opposed to just doing perhaps a management review, and to enable things like social shout-outs. And all of that gets captured and gets contributed to part of the performance appraisal on an ongoing basis. So the importance of having these continuous conversations and remaining very closely in touch with your employees and how they're doing, how they're working, what's working and what's not working for them is really a critical part of all of this. Now, millennials in particular have really important expectations about this. Excuse me. They are expecting to have these continuous conversations, to have continuous appraisals. But I think that what is interesting is that for those of us that are actually managing hybrid work teams, which consist of very diverse sets of people, the expectations of millennials is no different from the expectations of almost everybody that makes up the team. So this shift to continuous conversations is a really critical part of this change to becoming a people company. And that way, goals will change fairly quickly, but people can be kept in context. They can understand why things are changing, why the business might be moving in a different direction after a few weeks of setting goals, or you're able to pick up on things that need to be improved faster, or you can give real-time feedback and enable people to interact and change a little in order to meet different expectations. So a much more effective and contemporary way of managing performance. Now, one of the big challenges around people companies is the appreciation that this is not just the job of HR. Becoming a people company is not something that HR can possibly achieve on their own. The HR function can help lead this, can help influence this, but ultimately there are a whole range of other people that need to participate in this whole agenda, in this whole process. First of all, you need the C-suite to be fully on board. And by that, the chief people officer or the VP or the HR leader will work with their peers on the board, on the management team, in order to ensure that these fundamentals are really understood and that the values of the business really speak to this. There's no point, if you're in a company where, for example, there's a lot of transient workers or part-time workers, but there's a lot of churn, a lot of change because it's the nature of the business, then this won't be that applicable. But for companies where knowledge workers, for instance, are central or critical to success, this is absolutely fundamental. And so the issue here is, how does the management team lead by example? How does leadership work across the business? And how does your culture and core values really reflect what you're trying to do here? If all these aligned, this will happen almost spontaneously because it becomes part and parcel of what the company is all about. But if it doesn't, there may be a requirement for change. Many established businesses, for example, are having to go through this change as they recognize the challenges that we spoke of earlier and appreciate that the way things used to get done maybe 10 years ago or even 5 years ago just don't work today. And as a consequence of that, there's a new agenda, and they need to be not only part of that agenda, but they need to be stepping up, they need to be leading by example, and literally putting this into practice on a day-to-day basis. And it can be really simple. Coming back to some of the points we talked about earlier, for example, valuing, appreciating, recognizing, supporting, having those continuous conversations, all small examples of how you can make this shift to becoming a people company. Now, HR has a key part to play in all of this, of course, because not only is HR trying to lead the conversation in the business and lead some of this change, but to do that, it means that HR has to automate transactional processes. Now, we've been trying to do that for years, and all of us, I'm sure, will have various different types of applications that we're using to try to support us, and some are working better than others, but probably many these days, many of the established applications are probably starting to struggle a little bit to keep up as these changes happen. And so this is creating a twofold requirement. First of all, there's the ongoing need for HR to be able to automate these core processes so that the function is free to go and focus on the people and get into the business and provide more leadership and really drive this agenda. But also there's the appreciation that because these processes are changing, you need to ensure that the systems that you still have are actually able to support the changes. And in many cases, you may find that that's no longer the case. And so a lot of companies are now looking at not only how their processes are changing, but what new systems do they need to put in place, or what new apps do they need to bring into bear in order to facilitate this. And there's a whole plethora of new applications, new apps coming onto the market, which makes it very exciting. And that's all really good. There's an associated challenge with some of that, though, is that as you bring in new apps, you can end up with having people information scattered across different applications. And that means that you then have to think about, how do you actually manage this distributed information so that you can actually really understand your people using people science. And it also means that you have to be very careful about thinking about compliance-related issues. So, for example, if you are a company that has people working in different countries, particularly if you have people working in the European Union, for instance, the introduction of GDPR, which will come into effect in May, is something that is going to have a major impact on many of your processes and the sorts of things you have to do around data privacy, affecting those particular workers. Well, that's just the one example of how you have to think about these processes and information in perhaps a slightly different way. And if you've got lots of new apps and you've got data in these different systems, managing compliance like GDPR is going to be more difficult. So that's going to be something which is going to need some thought and attention over the days, weeks, and months ahead. So we've covered a number of points, 2 more to go now in terms of some of these key attributes of people companies. Number 8 is that they use integrated, intuitive, and mobile communications. Now, one of the things that I'm sure all of us recognize is that we are bombarded with information from multiple channels, multiple sources, all throughout the day. And we're not actually really helping ourselves because we tend to encourage this in terms of how we behave. So yes, we're on our computers and we're dealing with email and maybe business social channels and that sort of thing. We've got phones, obviously. We've got all our mobile apps. We're constantly bombarded with information. The challenge is we then get into a problem where we actually feel overloaded with information, almost overwhelmed. There's so much of it. Where do you start? What do you focus on? What's the most critical information? Now, if you're running a business, or if you're in HR, you'll know that very often there's certain key things that you want or you need your employees to do. Some of it might be around training or compliance or signing up for benefits or making sure that you've taken a course or whatever. The challenge very often is, how does the business know that their employees are actually getting access to the most critical information? If I'm in the CEO's office or on the management team, the CEO will know that there's certain key things that they want everybody in the business to know and be aware of this week. But if you actually did a quick survey to find out how many people really did know those 3 things, I think you would probably find that relatively few actually really did know that, or if they knew that, did they know how that applied to their job? And so modern communications is critical, and modern HR systems are now enabling both the CEO and key managers as well as HR to be able to provide focused communications as part and parcel of these new people applications, so that people know that if they need to get really critical information, the place you start with is your people app, and then from there you'll get taken to different centers. So it becomes the focal point for communications in the business. So it's not just about communications, but it's also content. So you'll be able to put in there, social feeds or video clips or streaming video, whatever you need. It doesn't really matter, but it's this whole concept of really using communications in a much more focused and a much more relevant way to try to reduce this information overload that exists in so many companies, which in turn can then help people be more efficient and effective and performing better because they are able to focus on what really matters. The other key part of this, of course, is then being able to do that so that these communications are available on mobile devices. Now, many HR apps, although they provide mobile support, sometimes the functionality offered is very limited. And more often than not, HR leaders may not necessarily be in a position where they can ensure that all the functionality that's necessary to support mobile working from an HR point of view is necessarily available to the workforce and to colleagues around the world. So one of the things that people companies are recognizing is that not only do they need to deal with the communications issue, but they also need to deal with this and be able to support this in a mobile context. So this is thinking very much in terms of, what of our HR processes need to be able to be managed in a remote mobile way? How do people communicate or pick up communications in a mobile way? How do we make it easy for people to use mobile applications and therefore remain productive? Now, there may be some processes which it doesn't really make a lot of sense to do on a mobile app. But equally, there'll be others where you probably could. So, for instance, being able to approve somebody booking some holiday or wanting some paid time off is something that a manager should be able to do quite easily on a mobile device from wherever they are, because A, it's not particularly complicated, or it shouldn't be. B, the employee or the worker will want to know as quickly as possible, has their request been approved? And it's important that the manager is able to do that as quickly as possible, A, to keep the employee, sort of feeling good about things, but also so that the manager understands, what's going on in the workforce and who's available when and where and so on. So the notion of being able to support truly mobile ways of working is fundamental. And in the context of HR, many companies still struggle to actually do that in a meaningful way. So finally, let's look at how companies are constantly thinking about technology, but thinking about it in a very interesting way. And what I mean by this is that we're starting to see how the world of HR is changing. We talked about people science, for example. So, the notion of having data analysts and data scientists working with or as part of HR. We talked about the importance of marketing within HR and the importance of the employer brand. We talked about the importance of communications within HR. We've alluded to the importance of, without sort of calling it out specifically, but the application of psychology in terms of managing some of these new processes and dealing with people. We've also started to recognize that HR can play a critical role in designing better ways of working in organizations. So now HR are designers. They're not just doing the things that HR have always done and done well. So what does this mean? Well, if you think about the way work gets done, very often we've got all these different processes that happen. And in the context of HR, there's an opportunity for us to constantly be asking the question, well, are there better ways of doing things? Are there better ways of working? We've seen that many of our processes are changing. For example, we talked about how performance management is changing. We talked a little bit about how recruitment is changing. Well, you take any of the core processes that you're involved in as an HR professional and think, well, is it a good process? Do people like it? Is it effective? How do people feel about it? Are there things that we could actually do to this to make it a lot better, to create much, much better experiences? But by doing it, by working with the people in the workforce. And you can do this by simply looking at processes. And with contemporary people applications, you can use techniques like pulse surveys to take ask a few questions really quickly, get that response back from the people that you ask the questions to through the pulse survey. That's captured in your system, which in turn gives you the reports and the analytics that you need to understand, well, what did people say? So let's take onboarding as an example. You come through the onboarding process with a group, and when they've been through that, they take a pulse survey in your system. You get that information, the results of that survey, almost instantaneously. And from that, depending on how you set this up, either who said what, or you can do it anonymously. Now, clearly, if people are prepared to provide more direct feedback, it helps, but in situations where maybe that's a problem, you can manage it anonymously. But the point being, you're now armed with information. The information you have will now tell you what people think about that whole onboarding experience. And you now have an opportunity where you can start redesigning that process by asking them what went well, what wasn't good, what didn't they like, why didn't they like it, what would you change if you were them, make the changes, change the system to support that through configuration, and then test the next group coming in on the onboarding process to see, well, did they get a better experience? Did the results, was it better than the previous one? So now HR can be in a position where they're actually thinking as a team, not just about the workforce in a traditional way, but actually how work gets done, the sort of processes that you have, and how you could start to really improve those processes using feedback loops and other types of communication, but changing your processes and leading that whole effort. So, a whole series of different things here, 9 different things. I won't go through each one again, simply because of time. But you can see that there are a whole series of these different criteria that really helping to describe a people company, what a people company is all about, and the sorts of things companies are doing to become people companies. So what's next? How do you become a people company? Well, it's not really so much about how we talk about this. Like anything, it's how this gets put into action. Okay? So it's no good just saying, well, we've now got a chief people officer. If that chief people officer isn't driving this drive towards the journey to become a people company, it's just another name for HR. So we're not saying that HR is bad, we're saying that HR is evolving, and it's this evolution and moving along this journey with some of the things that we've talked about, which is really critical in terms of how you get and put that into action. A simple thing that you can do straight up front is just say, well, if you were to ask some really simple questions, then how easy is it for you to answer them? And again, coming back to a quick survey that we did, we found that when we asked this, so if you ask, well, do you know how many people work for you? Well, 72% of that could answer that question immediately. But if you said, well, what's your vacancy fill rate? You can see straight away that only half the people that we asked could provide that answer immediately. And as you go through these other things, so you quickly get a feel from this as to, okay, I can do some things really well, but I can see where I've got problems, and I can see some of the things that I need to turn and spend more time focused on. So the final thing is, as you work through all of this, as you think about some of these concepts, as you think about some of these ideas and things that we've spoken about, there's almost a need to really sort of take a step back and think about some essentials. So for instance, if you look at your HR application today, to what extent does it support the company brand? To what extent does it look and feel like your organization as opposed to just, and it's another application from a vendor? To what extent can you tailor processes easily in your system? If you're a small company, you don't need lots of complex processes. You don't need to automate complexity. You want lightweight processes. But as you grow, your processes become more sophisticated or your processes change. But how quickly can you make those changes? How easy is it for you to do that? Or do you have to go and get a whole team of consultants and IT people involved in order to make any sorts of change at all? Because the former is an agile way of working with an agile people system, and the latter is what typically happens in most organizations today. How easily can you integrate employee communications into your HR or people app today? If you can do that today, that's great. But if you can't, that's something you need to be thinking about. If you can't do that, why can't you? That's part and parcel of becoming a people company, how you manage these different types of communications. Self-service. How good is the self-service experience? Can people really see their records, update their records, know what you're holding about them? That's something you're going to have to do if you need to be compliant with GDPR. And things like self-service is a key part of this, as is the people analytics piece. And then other things like mobile experiences, being able to run pulse surveys and get that feedback, design better ways of working. These are all examples of things that your contemporary people system needs to be able to support in order to help you on this journey. So I hope you've been interested in some of the points that have been made during the course of the presentation. If you're interested, you can download some of the research that we spoke about from the Sage People site, so that's sagepeople.com, and we'd encourage you to do that. We hope you find that interesting. And I now very happily open the floor up through questions about becoming a people company. So Mike, any questions?
There sure are, and we are going to turn to audience questions in just a moment. It's not too late to get them in. While you're getting your questions to us through the Q&A box on the lower left of your screen, we want to remind you about HRPS's annual conference, which takes place April 22nd through the 25th in Scottsdale, Arizona. This exclusive event offers an opportunity for executive HR leaders to learn from, engage with, and exchange ideas with noted business leaders, academics, and each other. Conference contributors will include senior results-oriented practitioners, researchers, and thought leaders who will explore the complex social, economic, and organizational issues that continue to shape how HR supports business. For more information, visit the HRPS homepage, hrps.org. This webcast can be claimed for recertification credit for the SHRM CP and SHRM SCP. To claim recertification credit, you can use the program number 18-IZAEX. That's 18-IZAEX. This number may be used for viewing the program live or on demand, and the program may be counted as 1 hour of professional development credit. With that, let's turn to some of the questions that have come in from the audience. Audience member has asked, can you think of any specific examples of a widely known company that's adopted a more people-progressive strategy? What was the strategy and what was the result after adoption?
So, really good question. There's actually lots of companies that are moving on this path. As I said earlier, this is a journey. This is not a once and done. It's not, oh, I just did this one thing and we instantly became a people company. So we're just starting out on this process. Now, we have a large number of customers that are focused on precisely these different sorts of attributes that we spoke about. Now, they're not all doing all 9 of them, and they're not all seeing the immediate results, but some are. So many of them have started out focusing on the foundation of becoming a people company by really looking at the data, analytics, and the people science conversation. And we've got, almost every one of our customers has started with that as the fundamental requirement. Because if you don't know your people, then you really can't apply some of these techniques very efficiently. Other things that people are doing quite quickly are using employer branding and being able to use the applications to do that very quickly, and therefore helps them market internally the brand a lot more effectively, which in turn also helps with things like the war for talent and being able to attract people into the business. And they're also using things like the ability to use either continuous conversations as part of performance management, or they're using other sorts of techniques around being able to manage teams more efficiently through organizational design within it. So it's not about being in a position where there's one brand and it's all done. There's multiple brands all starting out on the journey, all at different points on the journey, because this is going to take years before it all gets fully implemented. But what's exciting is seeing how companies are starting to have that effect. And the impact they have on it, it can be dramatic. So, for example, we've had situations where some customers had up to 40% attrition before they were using the system, and now having made that changes and being able to identify that, they brought that significantly down and much improved that sort of attritional problem. So, ongoing process, lots to do, but immediate signs of success.
Another audience member asks, if you were implementing these 9 points from scratch, which would you focus on first and why?
Well, it depends really where you are currently. As I said earlier, many of the customers that we have focused initially on being able to really get more information about their people. So typically what will happen is they're in a situation where they're either managing on spreadsheets or they've got lots of disparate systems and they're really struggling to get information quickly and effectively so that they can actually make data-informed decisions and get actionable insights to help the management teams. So very often our customers will start with that. Get the system in, get a single system of record, make sure that information is kept accurate and up to date through self-service, and then they will turn their attention to things like employee branding and the portal, because that's the interface, the self-service interface many will use in the business. And therein, once they've got the sort of basics in place, they'll then figure out, well, what's the next most compelling issue they've got. It could be around recruitment, it might be around performance, it could be around succession planning, whatever. And then each take what's their most pressing issue, and we'll then focus on that.
Well, thank you. With that question and answer, we are going to bring today's webinar to a close. We want to remind you the program can be claimed for recertification credit for SHRM CP and SHRM SCP certification. The program number is 18-ZAEX. It's important that you keep a list of all the HRPS webinars you've viewed. We can't go into our system and create a transcript of the programs you've watched. However, if your webinar activity is audited, we can provide verification of attendance. You just need to provide us with a list of programs you've viewed. Please contact HRPS at 888-602-3270 or email info@hrps.org. As we close, we want to thank today's speaker, Paul Burin from Sage People, for leading the discussion today. And we want to thank you for listening in and for joining us today. We hope you will join us for future HRPS programs. That concludes today's webinar.